the Shell Fisheries Council, just so you know, is comprised of practicing oystermen. So it's not, although it's appointed by the governor, it is actually oystermen that are sit on that council. I wanted to start by referring back to a paper. Actually, Jim was one of the co-authors on this paper that was published back in 2000, where they were addressing this sort of very issue back then as well, and even earlier than that it was addressed. And they talked about sort of conceptually, how can we make these things work together? How can we have the harvest that we want to have out there and also have the conservation strategies working together? And in this diagram over here, you see that if you have the right kind of primary production, the plant and phytoplankton growth, and you have the right kind of physical habitat, the right salinity, the right bottom, then oyster reefs can form on there. And if oyster reefs can form, then the suggestion is that you can get all these other benefits if you restore oyster reefs. But I think I agree with that, except for one part, and there's a box missing here, and that is the sustainable management side of this. If you aren't sustainably managing that harvest, then you're not going to sustain those oyster reefs. And if you don't sustain those oyster reefs, then you're not going to have all these other benefits. So restoration in and of itself doesn't create a sustainable harvest. It needs sustainable management. This requires very close participation with the industry. If you don't include the industry on it, you're not going to get their buy-in from it. You're not going to get their help, their assistance, and that's critical. You have to work together. So that allows you to create a sustainable management, which will help create a sustainable harvest. The sustainable harvest sustains these reefs, which then also sustains the ecological functions, at least at a level that can be helpful and beneficial to the ecosystem. Managing that loop is critical, and I'm going to try and tell you how we do that in New Jersey. I'm sure you've all seen graphs like this in the Chesapeake, sort of how landings have gone down over time. A lot of times you'll hear that landings are at 1% of historic harvests. I want to caution you that landings aren't really necessarily directly tied to the population levels. Okay, there are other factors that affect that. Today, disease mortality, things like MSX and dermo disease are really what is the major limiting factor of oyster production in Delaware Bay. Fisheries management, as a result, has had to evolve in order to maintain it to be economically viable. So in order to understand how we did this in Delaware Bay, I need to talk a little bit about the history of how the fishery worked in Delaware Bay. So the traditional fishery was a transplant fishery. They moved oysters from the seed beds in the upper part of the bay down to planted grounds that were leased in the lower part of the bay. This was done during something called bay season. Now, bay season was a limited harvest, like Jim just described, 2 months of harvest. It might have been 2 weeks, it might have been 10 weeks. It fluctuated, and that was how they controlled the harvest on bay season. One of the other rules that was implemented, that was something called the 40% rule. And the 40% rule said that if a bed contained less than 40% oysters by volume when an oysterman pulled his dredge across it, or when a regulator went out and sampled it, then that bed would be closed. Okay, so that was a control rule that was in there to try and decide how to open these beds up and protect the resource that's down there. All right, this is what the footprint of the fishery looks like today. It's a little bit larger than this. We don't worry about the areas of the bay that contain less than 2% of the oyster population. So on any one of these beds, we don't worry about that. These beds occur in the upper part of the bay. The different colors denote different management areas, and they're roughly aligned with the level of mortality that they see. So as you move down the bay and salinity increases, we get higher levels of mortality. So we have very low mortality beds, we call them, in the upper part of the bay, and high mortality beds in the lower part of the bay. And this graphic kind of shows you how mortality increases as you move down the bay and how those beds are assigned to these different regions. Yes?
What kind of distance are you talking about there?
That's about, how many miles is that, Steve? 16 miles? I was going to, yeah. Okay, so, and every one of those little squares, to give you an idea, every one of those little squares is 25 acres. Okay, so all the little squares that are drawn on here, that's a 25-acre square. So it gives you an idea of how big those are. These are all public beds, yes. Okay, so key management strategies that we use today. First was we changed the harvest control. So we went from the 40% rule to a total allowable catch, a quota. There's a limited quota, okay? And it's not based on 8 bushels a day per boat or anything like that. It's the number of oysters that you're allowed to take. You can take those oysters throughout the season that it's open. You could take them all in one day. You could take them a little bit every day, whatever fits your business plan. But there's a total number you're allowed to take. That's it. Then you have to stop. In order to do that, we have to have a quantitative survey. We have to know how many oysters are out there because we're taking a percentage of them. We're not going to, and so if the population is large, then that 2% is a large number of oysters. If the population is small, that 2% is a small number of oysters. So we have to know how many oysters are out there. So we do a quantitative survey every year. Direct marketing allows the oystermen to take them directly to market instead of having to plant them on their grounds where they're going to maybe lose some of them just through that transplant process and then maybe even more through predation and disease. They can market them directly. We have rebuilding programs, shell planting, and something we call the intermediate transplant program. And we have this area management, which is what's displayed on here, so that that distributes the fishing pressure, so that it's not that you can take 2% from everywhere. Some places you can take more, some places you can take less, some places will be closed, sort of like a rotational harvest, if you will. So every area is managed a little bit differently. In order to do that, we have an annual stock assessment workshop. This has been cooperatively managed since 1953 through the Shellfish Council. It was formalized. It's now a peer-reviewed process. So initially, our laboratory goes out and monitors oysters actually throughout the year, and it culminates with a spatially explicit population sampling so we know how many oysters are out there. That's then reviewed at this stock assessment workshop by a stock assessment review committee. That's the peer review process. The stock assessment review committee has 9 rotating positions on it. They've included people from several areas around the United States, mostly along the East Coast, some in the Gulf Coast. I don't know if we've had anybody from the West Coast. Folks from the Chesapeake, both Maryland and Virginia, and also some oystermen and some resource managers as well. These are those groups that come to meet together. So the DEP is the regulatory authority. They approve all these decisions. Our laboratory is responsible for doing the scientific survey to estimate the population and preparing a report on that. The Shellfish Council is all industry members, and they actually get to select the rates and the management activities that then get approved by the DEP. And then we have a steering committee that helps give us advice and prioritize any kind of science that we need to do. And then there's the stock assessment review committee, and its composition is listed there. The way this works over the course of the year is the first thing we do is we sort of update our map of where the oysters are so we know where we're going to set up our sampling program. If we don't know where they are, that doesn't really help us in developing our sampling program. We then do that survey and we quantify the oysters everywhere. We have a way to calculate our estimate of error. So just because we sampled there doesn't mean we know exactly how many there are, but we have a good idea, and we know it might be plus or minus to a certain degree. We review all the other data that was being collected on mortality, disease, recruitment. We have a shell budget model, fishery statistics, like how many boats are in the fishery, what's their catch per unit effort, those sorts of things. And the SARC then evaluates all that, and they do it relative to abundance reference points. So we've looked at our long-term data and we said, okay, what is a reasonable amount of oysters to try and maintain in this system? How do we get to that level? And are we above that level or below that level? So we have these reference points and we look at those as well as these regional metrics. And then we provide quota recommendations. And there's a little bit of play in there. So maybe this area is doing a little bit better, so we can harvest it a little bit more this year. This area over here is not doing so well, so we back off on it. And those kinds of recommendations are made. This process has resulted in a viable fishery in the face of high natural levels of mortality. We've kept the fishing pressure very low at 2% of the entire stock. The essential element is that we have this tripartite, this triumvirate of industry, regulators, and researchers working together to get us to this point. It's essential to have a quantitative survey. It's essential to have a strict quota. It's essential to have area management, and it's essential to have a rebuilding program. Because when you're harvesting the oyster shell, as you just heard, you're harvesting their habitat. You have to put that back and rebuild it somehow. We do that through a shell planting program. That's our primary tool to do that. This is currently funded entirely by the industry. The industry has decided to tax themselves for every bushel that is harvested. They pay $2 for every bushel that's harvested. It goes into an account that pays for the rebuilding program. Occasionally we get other sources of funding, grants, for, either from state or federal levels or from private foundations to help supplement that effort. So I'll just end again with this diagram that started out with an emphasis on that sustainable management is what's going to help create a sustainable harvest. And you have to have those things working together. All right. Thank you.
All right, so we'll take a couple questions. So let me just take a second to explain something. What we're going to do is the 4 speakers and 3 additional panelists are going to come up after the 4 speakers. We're going to have a lot more time. It's going to be more engaging, more opportunity for you to ask questions and discuss. So there's going to be lots of time to do that. But we do want to get through the 4 presentations, so we'll take 1 or 2 questions. Again, we have a whole piece on shell later this afternoon. You were from the first time, so go ahead.
Yeah.
You say your name.
Don Bosch. What's who can fish? How do you limit entry? How do you allocate the quota among the?
Okay, so currently there are 81 licenses that are 81 licenses. There are no more licenses available in the state of New Jersey, at least for Delaware Bay. And the quota is allocated evenly amongst those licenses. Now, an individual can own more than one, or a company can own more than 1 license. A license used to be tied to an individual boat. That is no longer the case, and they can consolidate 3, is it, Steve? Or 6 now. 6 licenses may be consolidated onto a single boat.
Go ahead, man. Say your name, please.
How long has this program been in effect, and have you seen an increase in viability of the oyster population?
Okay, so the direct market fishery began in 1996, and the populations have fluctuated throughout that time. So we've had a recruitment failure. We've had years where we've had good recruitment. This current year we're seeing, right now, we just started our survey a week ago Friday, and we're seeing high levels of recruitment in the upper part of the beds. Those are the only samples we've looked at so far. It's stable. I won't say that it's increasing dramatically yet. Our key to getting it to increase is to increase the shell planting program so we can increase the amount of habitat that is available.